everyone's time today and get started. So good afternoon and welcome to the 7th session of our 9-part series on emergency planning. This session today will focus on building a resilient team post-COVID-19. My name's Katie. I'm a quality improvement advisor with Superior Health Quality Alliance. I will be facilitating the meeting today with my Superior Health colleagues. We have Ali Albers, Mike Bittner, Christy Fable, and Tony Kettner. Before I introduce our speakers for today's call, I just want to take a moment to review a few housekeeping items. We will post the slide deck several times into the chat box. You'll see it there now for your convenience. Please feel free to add questions or comments into the chat box as we go along as you think of them. We will answer all questions at the end of the call. There will be an opportunity to ask live questions as well at the end of the call, and we will review that process a little bit later on. The series is being recorded and will be available on the Superior Health YouTube channel. In about 2 weeks, this will allow you and your team to access the recordings on demand when it's convenient for you. We will post an evaluation link at the end of today's call. We would greatly appreciate it if you would take a moment and complete that for us. We do use the evaluations to improve calls and to determine if there's other topics you may find information about helpful. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers, Brian Kaczmarski and Amy Woolman-Nesseth. Welcome, Amy and Brian.
Great, thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. We're going to jump right in. There's a lot of information we're going to talk about today, and I'll echo selfless plug here for the recordings on the YouTube channel. If nothing else, just go in there once or twice a day and just hit click play, click play, click play. You don't even have to watch the whole thing, but we're trying to get as many hits as possible so that we go viral. So if you guys could help us out with that, that would be much appreciated. We're going to talk a little bit about some lessons learned from COVID and actually what we're seeing post-COVID with some key terms today, resilience and recovery. You're also going to see the word resistance as well. So we're going to try to talk about the relationship between those three terms and recognition that these are tools. So not only are they skills, but they're tools to allow us to better handle negative stressors that we face every day. And we clearly know that the last 3 years of COVID-19 was a chronic stressor. And then we're going to demonstrate some tools that you can use on the job in real time, try to help cope with those things and help your colleagues as well. That's next slide. So we talk about resilience, and this is the formal definition of resilience. So it's a process, and it's an outcome of successfully adapting. And what we're adapting to is a stressor, okay? So that could be a challenging life experience, mental, emotional, the gamut of the dimensions of health are impacted because we have to adjust to this big bad thing that is happening in our lives. And again, when Amy and I first developed this presentation, I mean, we were still in the throes of COVID, but we were starting to see numbers go down. And as we went around and did different trainings, we just saw staff who were fried, just absolutely burned out. And the biggest thing that we noticed, and the most common thing that folks said is, we're stuck. We don't know what to do next. And that really was the impetus behind creating some of these different trainings for, in essence, a broad spectrum of the healthcare workforce. Next slide. So how many times have you heard, just tough it out, things will get back to normal relatively soon? Well, resilience doesn't assume that you're going to get back to normal. It's not just bouncing back. It's not just taking a hit and performing at a diminished capacity for a period of time. There may never be a normal if it's a significant enough event. So what we try to focus on is, what's that new normal? What is your new normal going to look like? And if you had to stop and answer that question right now, again, as we're coming out of the pandemic. The public health emergency is set to end on May 11th. The federal declaration is set to end on May 11th. So I guess that could be a milestone that we've reached the end of the COVID pandemic. But I would argue that we're rolling right into a couple other public health emergencies. I would venture to say that if you had to compare where you're at on May 11th compared to where you were in March 2020, things probably wouldn't look the same or normal. So I think it's an accurate assumption to say we are all adjusting to our new normal right now. And that's something that takes recognition. You can't, that's not something that we recommend that you suppress or just suck it up. um, we think it's important to be intentional about acknowledging that you've been through a lot. Your coworkers have been through a lot. Your patients have been through a lot. And understanding that it's okay to be a little off or to not have your A game. Next slide. So what do we know about resilience? So resilience, there are genetic components to resilience. There's a very significant social component to resilience. You'll always hear people say if you have a strong network, you're more likely to have traits and characteristics that will mitigate things like depression and anxiety. And then your life experiences. If you happen to be an individual who has gone through their share of past traumas or past negative experiences, you may have built up some skills to be able to deal with those negative stimulus that come your way. So all of those things factored together builds up your capacity to be resilient. But we can have the most resilient individual in the world if they're faced with something that is chronic, prolonged, uncertain, i.e., right at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't know the mortality and morbidity rates, and we based a lot of our assumptions on this is going to have a very high attack rate. And there was a lot of uncertainty, and people were very on edge during those times. Even the most resilient can be challenged. And think of your team, your workforce, and there are always those people that always seem to have the appearance that they have it together, that they're always calm and cool under pressure. Even those people can and will be negatively impacted by something that lasts a long period of time. However, just like anything else, resilience can be learned. You can strengthen your resiliency base, and there are many simple tools that would allow us to do that. Next slide. So again, unless you were alive in 1918, and my kids think I literally was alive in 1918, but nonetheless, this is all new to us. So going through what we've gone through is really uncharted waters for today's public health workforce, healthcare workforce in general. So again, think back to the beginning. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was in a role of being a health officer. And so we were having guidance coming at us fast and furious, and it changed on a consistent basis. And as soon as we were communicating guidance out to our key partners within our jurisdictions, we had to turn right around and message them again and say, oh, forget about what we just said. This is now the most current guidance. So there was a lot of frustration and confusion very early on. There was also a lot of concern for bringing it home. So healthcare workers, frontline workers, those of us that deal, with taking care of people, we were very concerned about the potential of bringing it home. And that's when you saw strategies like healthcare organizations renting out hotel spaces so that their staff could stay there. And that alleviated the concern of potentially bringing it home to their families. Working with our most vulnerable populations, I know many states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, we all hear the term health disparities. And there was great recognition that there were health disparities during the pandemic. And in spite of best efforts and intentionality, those people that had health disparities prior to the pandemic, they suffered more during the pandemic, in spite of the fact that we were intentional, about saying we need to reach those that have those health disparities first. I'm sure many of you can remember the lockdowns, the protocols for visitations, the window visits that became very, very famous. And then masks and hand sanitizer and all of the resources that at the beginning of the pandemic were very, very scarce. And I don't think many of us can remember even back to the time when we didn't have the vaccine, because it's become so abundant now. But there was a very considerable period of time where there was no vaccine for this. And again, that lended itself to the intensity of the situation. Next slide. On top of everything that was going on, this chronic stressor that we faced every day, life continued to happen. Okay, there were still marriages, there were still divorces, we still had financial stress, the stresses of raising a family, our own mental health issues that we may have been dealing with prior to the pandemic. All of that stuff didn't just get put on hold. All that stuff continued, and then we compounded on top of that the additional stressors that went along with the pandemic. So we all were under an immense amount of pressure and stress. Next slide. So I mentioned the dimensions of health, and typically the dimensions of health are cognitive, physical, emotional, behavioral, and spiritual. And I'm not going to take the time to read through all of these, but there's a few that I would like to point out. Sleep disorders. One of the things we heard loud and clear from healthcare workers in general is a high uptick in issues with sleep. Lack of focus. Lack of focus in the healthcare world can be dangerous because it can lead to errors. And those errors can have very significant impact on the patients that we serve. From a physical perspective, just chronic fatigue. Think about those days when we were at the peaks, the highest numbers of cases, and you would get home and you would literally have no energy to do anything else. You made it to the couch, and that's about as far as you got. And then you knew the next day you had to get up and go through that process again. In the emotional sphere, anxiety, fear, depression, lots of studies out there post-pandemic that shows significant spikes in levels of anxiety and depression, just from the perspective of number of prescriptions for those disorders. In the behavioral health world, the withdrawal, the inability to rest or turn off. I can remember early on those 80 to 100-hour weeks, and there was no such thing as Saturday and Sunday off. You were working nonstop during that particular period of time. But I really want you to focus on that withdrawal one. I mentioned earlier that the public health emergency is ending. I actually believe that we're rolling into not only other public health emergency, and that's a staffing shortage as a direct result of the pandemic. Again, remember, we've lost 40% of our health workforce. That alone is a public health emergency. And when I say public health, I'm talking global. I'm talking the world of healthcare. So I believe that we're currently in the middle of a public health crisis because of the staffing shortage. The other one, how many people heard the Surgeon General come out this week with his latest belief of the next public health emergency that we're rolling into? Does anybody know what the Surgeon General said just very, very recently? You can put it in the chat if you know it. You get a Brian and Amy bobblehead if you get it correct. I mean, this is really big stuff here, people. But what Surgeon General said is loneliness is the next public health emergency that we're going to need to deal with. So think about people in our communities, people that we serve that are suffering from loneliness, but the pandemic forced them into isolation. So now you have a compounding effect of not only are they lonely, but we have social distancing and restrictions in place that are going to force us to not have the ability to go out and seek those social connections. And that was the root cause that started to spin up this most recent Surgeon General warning about loneliness. We know that there was uptick in what we refer to as self-medication, and that's the use of alcohol and other substances to try to manage all of the issues and emotions that people are feeling with. And then in the spiritual side, maybe Amy will touch on this, but just questioning your faith in humanity. How many times, due to the political climate that ended up arising out of COVID with vaccine and mandatory vaccinations and mandatory social distancing measures, how many people believed, people were just going to do the right thing? I think in healthcare, we believed people were going to go ahead and get vaccinated and they were going to adhere to the restrictions in place. And we were really going to amp down on that bell-shaped curve of the COVID pandemic. And we all saw that that didn't happen. And we can debate all we want the reasons for that, but there was a lot of loss of faith in humanity. And that's listed as one of the main reasons for the quote, great resignation, where so many people looked at the careers that they were in, including healthcare, and said, you know what? My priorities just aren't the same right now. It caused a lot of self-reflection, which led to that mass exodus out of the workforce. Next slide. So really what I've been talking about is chronic or cumulative stress. And again, the definition of that, consistent long-term sense of feeling pressure and overwhelmed over a period of time. And it compounds, it builds upon itself. And it usually happens so gradually that it sneaks up on us to the point that we're already at a very bad place before either a friend recognizes it, coworker recognizes it, or God forbid something unfortunate happens to the point where you're forced to recognize it and then have to address it from a personal perspective. Next slide. The concept of burnout, okay? Burnout is a real thing. It's not just a term. It's not just what my 22-year-old does with his motorcycle, although he does do that quite significantly. But the World Health Organization actually defines burnout, and it's chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And who is in charge of managing that? Most people would point to leadership because, again, leadership has multiple job duties, and with the title go the privileges as well as the responsibilities. And chronic workplace stress typically manifests itself in staff exhaustion, cynicism, and diminished job performance. So there are economic impact to burnout. And one of the most telling quotes that I like to say is, when your most passionate people go quiet, you've got a problem. And that should be a trigger for not only administration, but if you remember, Amy and I in the past trainings have talked about the concept of a leader in every chair. Anybody can notice that. And when all of a sudden your typical champions, those people that are the most vocal, the leaders, so to speak, when those people go quiet, your agency is likely in a phase of burnout. And that should be a trigger for action. Next slide. So how do we do this? What does this resilience thing mean? And I'm going to start with the very top there, and that's the concept of resistance. Resistance is the ability to stay within the parameters, the window of normalcy, as long as you possibly can. Remember, over a period of time, even those that have high levels of resistance are going to get chipped away at. So we're going to get to that point where we start to experience some of those signs and symptoms that I mentioned on the other slide. That's where resilience comes in. Resilience is a recognition that you are not in a state of normalcy and you need to work to get back to what we talked about that new normal is. And that's the concept of recovery. So resistance is holding out as long as you possibly can. Resilience is recognizing that you're not at a point of holding out anymore. You're below that. But resilience is that ability to get back to that new normal as quickly and efficiently as you can. And that process is known as recovery. So you see how that cycle occurs. Next slide. So resistance is understanding and acknowledging what you're experiencing. So one of those things might be recognizing and naming mental health concerns. 40 million of us have an anxiety disorder. 50% of our population with depression also have an accompanying anxiety disorder. If you're not socially anxious, be kind to those people that are, because if you're in a room with 10 people, 5 of them may have some type of social anxiety. Another thing that I want you to think of, and I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but think to yourselves, as some of our social restrictions have started to loosen up, have you noticed yourself feeling uncomfortable in those quote back to normal situations? I was in a healthcare facility in the Twin Cities, and I was hopping on an elevator, and I got on the elevator, and nobody was wearing a mask, and it took me back for a minute. I'm like, what? Why are you people not wearing a mask? And we are getting back to those normal, quote, normal things, and for a lot of people, that's an adjustment. Some people became very comfortable being socially isolated and having our Zoom and our go-to meetings and things like that. And now we're getting back to where we're having face-to-face meetings. And that is a transition for all of us. But for some people, it can be very difficult. So the message is be kind to those other people. If you yourself are excited to get back to those face-to-face meetings and normal interaction, recognize that there are people around you that are going to have a harder time, and show empathy towards them. Next slide. The concept of trauma-informed care, not only to your patients, but to staff as well. I would just pose a question. How many of your agencies are trauma informed? It's a thing. It's a certification. It's a program that your agency can go through. Talk about pre-incident education. It's not the if, it's when. We're going to have another pandemic. We're going to have another public health emergency. What type of resistance can you build in your staff as a precursor to when that next big bad thing happens? And there are tools and there are evidence-based models out there that you can incorporate. So again, understand that all of that is building up something that's known as stress inoculation. Why do you take a vaccine? You inoculate yourself to protect against whatever that virus is or whatever that disease is. Stress is our disease. What can we do to inoculate ourselves to the next big stressors that are coming down the road? Next slide. And that's the concept of resilience, sometimes referred to as psychological body armor. How many people remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Okay, the old base foundation, basic needs, exercise, sleep, eat. And then that social connectedness, which again, now that's loosening up, so we have the ability to do that. And then healthy coping skills, not the self-medication and things that we saw spikes in during the height of the pandemic. And then this is the tie to preparedness, and I'll be turning it over to Amy next, but that prepare and practice piece, the reason that your agencies build these preparedness plans, train on these preparedness plans, and then exercise on these preparedness plans is you're building up resistance so that you are able to function at a high level when the next emergency happens. And when it does, and we fall under that resistance line, we have resiliency tools in place to get us back to a state of normal more efficiently. Next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So Brian was just referring to many of the skills and the coping techniques that are available to us that we talked about in the social determinants of health in our health equity program that we presented. It's important to remember that, again, from a health equity perspective, those who have less health equity are also the ones that have fewer coping strategies or coping mechanisms. An example of that would be to think about, Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, way back when. People who didn't have access to transportation or didn't have access to a good social network where they had people that they could evacuate to or even have access to get out of the city, those were the people who ended up staying and were the people that were most deeply impacted by the ravages of that hurricane and the flooding that came as a result. So building up our personal and our community social determinants of health, making sure people have access to education and healthcare and stable housing and financial resources or assistance and good social networks, all of those things are important when it comes to building resilience. But when that resilience isn't enough, I think about that psychological body harmer, which is a great illustration, and I love that picture of the squirrel. But even the best body armor has kinks, right? Or has those gaps where something can sneak in and catch us unaware. When we face something that is completely unknown or unprecedented to us, something that we never could have imagined, or when the losses are so great that they really change our lives, our stories, who we know ourselves to be, our identities, our family structures, all of that can have a more significant impact and can sneak into those kinks in our body armor. The illustration I think of most is one of the reasons that fire departments, firefighters train as much as they do is because when the bad day happens, they've got that muscle memory. They've got that ability to take action without really thinking emotionally. But if something comes up where it's a child that looks exactly like their child, or if it's a coworker, or if it's someone that they know, that is the kink in the armor, and it can cause just tremendous trauma and stress reactions. Going into a 3-year pandemic when we didn't know when or if there was going to be an end, that was part of the unknown and the unprecedented that has caused so many of us to really realize that the stress or the skills that we had to alleviate that stress maybe wasn't enough. So once we talk about, resistance and resilience, then we get to that part about recovery and restoration. And really what that's about is giving people the opportunity to regain a sense of control in their own lives. When we go through a stressful or traumatic situation, those who often find themselves feeling like they're completely out of control of their situation, things are happening to them. So one of the best strategies to help someone move through a critical incident is to give them the ability to regain control, even if it means just deciding who they want to have with them in the room at this time, or what they want to have for lunch tomorrow. taking the steps to take those tiny little decisions will help people regain control. And that is really the first step towards recovery. We also get to the point where we often need to seek meaning in what just happened to us. If we go through a traumatic event, what does this mean in the greater scheme of life? And that is a process. That's not something where suddenly somebody goes, aha, I understand it. That is a process of working through the grief and the new, coming to terms with what that new normal looks like. When Brian and I started doing these presentations, and we've done many of them throughout the state and in individual public health departments and other places, grief is something that we talk about a lot. I talk about it from my perspective as a former chaplain, but grieving the things that we've lost, grieving the milestones. Think of the kids that lost their senior year of high school, or their prom, their sports season. Think about the individuals that we've lost. The loss of respect within the community. Healthcare providers used to be the go-to, but then there was a lot of scrutiny, and there were a lot of people that stopped listening to what public health authorities or people in leadership in healthcare had to say. And in order to move forward from this experience, we really need to take the time to be intentional about grieving those things that we've lost and finding ways to honor the things that we have lost. This is all about talking about how do we integrate this into our story. And integration is again, a process. It's something that takes time, and it's something that takes effort and intentionality. I would argue that we also need to take the time to listen to each other's stories. Again, that's one of the tools for recovery, is to take an intentional time to hear where people are coming from within your department, within your agency. Hear how they are building their own resilience, how they're taking steps to move to recovery, and how they're doing that. What is their pandemic story? Or if it's a fire, or if it's a tornado, what is your story? When I worked for the Red Cross Spiritual Disaster Team, that was probably the most important thing that I did, was go to the shelters, go to the hospitals, go to the funeral homes, and just listen to people tell their story, because that is a very important part of beginning to claim that story and to move into the next step of recovery. And then all of this is about adapting to whatever that new normal is going to be for that person or for that department. And I have no idea what I just did, and I'm going to undo that. That's interesting. Anyway, okay, next. Oh, geez, now I don't know if I can undo it. That's hilarious. Well, okay, well, we're going to live with that. So we're going to be intentional, right? As I said, the U.S. Surgeon General again has said things like, we have a choice in how we choose to move forward. He said this, I think, back in 2021. But, people were really wanting to get back into, we want to get away from these lockdowns. We want to get it down away from all of these things. And the Surgeon General gave us kind of hey, wait a minute, maybe we should think about not rushing into things, but to be very intentional about how we're going to pick and choose what we choose to go back to. And I don't know if your agency has had some conversation around, because my guess is, again, you're not doing things the same way that you used to before the pandemic. All of this means that we're going through a transition period. So in the aftermath of chronic stress or adversity, we have to go through that transition period to get back to feeling where we are safe and to have the adaptive behaviors that are going to help us move through today, but whatever the next thing is going to be. So this is a time of transition. Most of the country in the world have moved on already. But for those of us who work in the healthcare system, the ending of this public health emergency is another huge milestone and huge transition. We are going back to all of the requirements that we've had before. There are no more waivers. And so we need to be ready for that transition. So tools in the toolbox. There are so many tools out there to build resilience, from coloring sheets to much more intentional therapy to other kinds of things. But we're going to mention just a few of them here. So the first one is what's called Skills for Psychological Recovery. This is a really helpful program. It is completely free. It's available through the va.gov. I apologize for the noise here. I'm in a different setting right now. But it's really about gathering information and prioritizing what you as a person or your community need to get through this, to build problem-solving skills, promote positive activities. Again, that's getting back in touch with those social connected networks, managing reactions, promoting helpful thinking, and again, rebuilding those social connections. This is a great tool. It's something that you can do as an individual. It has some worksheets. It has some great opportunities for conversation starters within your team to build and to work through some of these skills. So I would really encourage you to check that out as well. So let me just give you an example of one of those tools. It's about managing reactions and expectations. And it basically talks about 3 steps. And the first is to stop the train. So this is what Brian was alluding to before. I live in Dunn County, Wisconsin, and I believed that when the vaccine came out, everybody in Dunn County was going to do the right thing. We were going to have vaccination rates of 80, 90%. It was going to be, we were going to get ourselves out of this pandemic. The problem was, I think Dunn County today is maybe just over 50% vaccination rate. And so what ended up happening is I started to get incredibly frustrated and incredibly disappointed because my expectations were here, but the reality was here. And I couldn't figure out why I was angry and why I was losing faith in humanity and my neighbors. And it was, again, because I was having these incredibly high expectations that simply weren't realistic. And so sometimes we have to let go of some of those expectations. We have to recognize what we have control over, what we don't have control over, and then we need to be more realistic in our setting of those expectations. The other one is minding the gap. Again, monitoring how you are responding emotionally to those kinds of failures and expectation. And again, recognizing that our emotional responses are choices sometimes. We can reframe how we're looking at something, and we can express gratitude in times when we're really feeling not that gracious, or when we're not really feeling that positive about the situation. We can take a moment to step back and reevaluate and look at how we want to approach this. The last one is what's called changing the channel. When you realize that you're catching yourself either with your self-talk or with your colleagues, and you're just stuck in that negative self-talk cycle where nothing is positive, you're just slamming on everybody. Eventually, recognize when that's happening and be able to take a step back and try to change that channel. Change the kind of messages that we're telling ourselves and promoting within our organizations, because the negative talk isn't going to get anything accomplished. But if we're able to recognize when we're stuck in that and then change the channel to something that is perhaps more positive, then we are able to get into a better place emotionally. It helps build our resilience, and it helps us through that recovery. And it has some very specific examples, things like getting outside, taking that walk, that 5-minute break. If you're a person of faith and prayer is important to you, take time to do that every day. Journaling. People talk about doing the 5 gratitudes at the end of the day. What are 5 things that you're thankful for? Those are all great tools and things that we can think about. There's also conversation starters. How do you cultivate optimism within your organization? How do you think about or talk about how have I changed? How has this organization changed? What are the things that we are doing better because of this experience that we've been through? That's a helpful thing to do. Making a list of the things you can and you cannot control. If somebody had sat me down and said, Amy, you really have no control over what the people in Dunn County choose to do. Just being able to list that and have that named would have been helpful for me at one point. Discussing and accepting the events. Again, we know that things are going to happen to us and that we're going to be a part of, that we will have little control over. But being able to focus on, okay, how am I reacting to this? Am I approaching this in the most positive way that I can? Giving yourself permission to feel rotten and to have those negative moments, but then again, being able to recognize it, be intentional about that recognition, and then being able to switch gears. All of those things are important. And if we can talk about it with each other, we can learn from each other about how to do that. These are just some other examples of conversation starters. What is hard? I mean, there's a lot of things that are hard in this world and in our lives. And if we can have an opportunity to discuss them, that's great. What are your short-term and your long-term goals? Not just for you personally, but for your organization. How do you, the hardest question to ask is, where do you see yourself in 5 years, right? Where do you see your organization in 5 years? And can we build some of these skills to get us to those places? Check it out. That's a really good one. It's a good one that I used to use in chaplaincy. People sometimes get very focused. We call it perseverating, right, on certain things. But sometimes if we take a moment to check it out, am I reacting? Am I overreacting? Am I underreacting? Am I reading this situation correctly? Those are ways to check it out. And to not just assume that the way we're seeing something is the reality or the fact. Do you have people like that in your life that you can check things out with, to say, and who are willing to give you honest feedback? That's really important. It has got to be somebody or some group of people that are willing to be honest and say, I think you are overreacting. So let's think about another way to look at this. And again, back to the quality improvement part, if we are trying a strategy and it just doesn't seem to be working, are we willing to step back from using that strategy and let's try something different? So use that within your organization in a staff meeting. We're trying to institute some new policy, some new plan. Is this working for you? Are you feeling safe? Are you feeling comfortable? If it's not working, then let's try something different. That's an important part of this whole process. This is also an interesting tool. It's called the 1-minute pause. This was actually introduced originally as a slogan for Coca-Cola back in the 1940s. But it's, again, that being very intentional about utilizing the time in our lives, in our work life and our personal life, to be reflective about where we are, checking in with ourselves emotionally, listening to the self-talk and being able to check that, and being able to recognize when we need to try something different. So think about those times in your day when you have that 1 minute. Okay, maybe it's when you're walking from one meeting to the next. In a few minutes, I'm going to be leaving where I am right now and going to my car to go to another meeting. Well, I've got a couple minutes. So how am I going to use that time? Is it when am I going to be looking at my phone and get hit by a car in the crosswalk? Or am I going to take that moment to just kind of say, well, what's happened today so far? How am I feeling? I'm enjoying the sunshine. Take that time to be intentional. Bathroom breaks, we all have to use the bathroom from time to time. Again, what are you doing? Are you taking time to be intentional about thinking about where you are emotionally while you're taking care of your physical needs? Work breaks. When are you feeling stress and tension in your day? And again, if you recognize that, take a moment, take that 5-minute walk. to help you get through that difficult time. Some other examples: coffee time, starting the car, driving. Driving is a great time to do that self-reflection, right? As long as you're still paying attention to the road. But, so much of the time we fill our space with talk, with noise, with music. And I think it's helpful when we can take the time to just be in the quiet, showering, dog walks, all of those kinds of things. So to summarize, and then I want to make sure we have a little bit of time for questions. Resiliency is really all about growth. You may remember that very, very first slide, the picture that was on that slide. It was a picture of a new shoot of grass or some sort of growth coming through a dead leaf. This was a picture that I took when I was up in the Boundary Waters in northern Minnesota. And to me, it was just an incredible picture that reminded me that even in the midst of all the crap of the pandemic, the deadness, the frustration, the anger, all the things that we were just struggling with, new life continued to burst through that, literally grow through that. And that's really what resiliency is all about, is that opportunity to grow and to learn about ourselves. So recognize and embrace those new opportunities, build stronger relationships with the people around you. It is a time to cultivate that inner strength and to gain a deeper appreciation for life. I think many of us discovered that through the pandemic, or whenever we go through a time when we risk or actually lose people we love. And then, as Brian said earlier, part of the Great Resignation was that redefinition of meaning and purpose. People want to do work that means something. And that is in part a result of what we have been through, in part of the post-traumatic growth that has come from this difficult time. So I think that's it. There are some references here and some links. I absolutely cannot finish this presentation without talking about suicide prevention. This is just so vitally important, and we know that burnout is one of the triggers or one of the leading causes of suicide. And so please, if you yourself are struggling, or if someone within your organization is struggling, there is help out here. And I think one of the questions people need to ask is, do you really want to die? Or do you just not want to live the way that you're currently living? And I think if we ask more people that question in that crucial moment, maybe some of those results would be different. But there are resources. Of course, the national number now is 988. Please make sure that people are aware of that. And don't be afraid to refer someone. All right, any questions?
If you do have a question, feel free to type it into the chat. You can also unmute yourself. If you're joining from a phone, that is *6.
Amy, do you want to advance to the last slide while we're waiting for questions? And
You bet.
Perfect. Yeah, just as a reminder, Superior Health Quality Alliance has a service available. All organizations should have a public health emergency preparedness plan that addresses emerging infectious diseases. Whether you're a community health partner or a nursing home, there is some availability for you. Please complete the short 2-question form and let Superior Health know how we can support you in your emergency preparedness planning. There's a form for community health partners, and there's a form for nursing homes as well. And of course, refer any questions to Toni Kettner. She's on this call today. Her email is there for you. And in addition, we had a question earlier about the YouTube channel. Christy from Superior Health posted that link in there. I will put that in there again as well, so you can see the previous sessions and then this one moving forward too.
Yeah, I think I just want to point to the chat as well. Scott had pointed out some really good points that, and again, the pandemic was so big and there were leadership failures at every level. And I'm absolutely speaking federal, state, et cetera. Many of us were hamstrung. There was only certain things that we could do in the midst of all this, especially around regulation. And so I take your points to heart, Scott, and agree that unfortunately some places were not allowed to have free conversation about the things that went well and things that did not go well. I think as we get further past the pandemic, there will still be opportunities for those conversations, I hope. And that, again, as Brian said, bringing in a third party kind of mediator can be helpful. We've done that. And it's been very interesting, good conversation, and hopefully some good things have come from that. But it's very difficult, and you are not alone in some of the points that you've raised. Tony did point or include something in the chat. This is the new QSO memo that came out. I believe it was dated May 1st. It's just a reminder to all of you, if you have not read this, please do. It's just a reminder that all of those waivers that we had during the pandemic are now going away. And so everything from how you train your nurse assistants to emergency preparedness ruling, all of those things are coming back into the quote unquote normal. But with new normal, meaning that there are some additions to your HVA that need to be included, infectious disease. You have to have plans in place that were lessons learned from the pandemic. But the one thing I want to point out in particular is the exercise requirement. Again, because Tony's going to promote the fact that we're going to be doing some exercising into the coming year. Both how to write your own exercise, but then we're actually going to be facilitating some virtual exercises that you will all have an opportunity to be a part of. But keep in mind that if you activate your emergency operations plan, however you define that, it can be used, if it's a real event, it can be used to count towards one of those exercise requirements. The key is that when the event is all over and done with, you need to capture what you learned from that in what's called an after action report. And again, the four pieces to that are what should have happened, what did happen, what were the things that went really well, and what are the improvement plans for things that could have been improved. And then you demonstrate that you've actually closed the loop on those things that need to be improved. So again, if you have a real event, take the time. It is worth your time and effort to capture those lessons learned, to count that as one of your exercises. And that is emphasized in that memo as well.
And I just put a link into chat. We're hosting a 4-part series. Amy alluded to that. It's the first 4 weeks in August, and it's all about how to learn how to develop, design, and evaluate an exercise training plan specifically for nursing homes. So we hope that you'll register and participate in our ongoing support of emergency preparedness planning.
Great. So if there are no more questions, thank you so much, Brian and Amy, for sharing that great information that will help everyone better prepare. Thank you to all of you that joined today. Our next webinar in this series will be on May 25th, and the topic will be Nursing Home Incident Command System. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.